Honestly, Dad, could you not come? I can't have a dirty laborer smelling of oil walking me down the aisle." The words weren't shouted. They were worse. They were whispered, a sharp, sterile slice of contempt delivered in the pristine, white living room of my daughter's new condo. A condo bought with a down payment I'd given her. Money earned over 1,000 grueling shifts, where the smell of oil was the very air I breathed. She stood there, my Sarah, a perfect stranger in a silk blouse, clutching a binder filled with floral arrangements and seating charts for the wedding of her dreams. My dream, I thought. The dream I'd funded with 50 years of broken-down body and calloused hands. I looked down at those hands, the knuckles thick, the fingernails permanently underlined with a grease that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. These were the hands that had held her as a baby, that had fixed her bicycle chain, that had signed every tuition check. Now, they were the source of her shame. I had just come from my final shift at the mill, a 16-hour marathon I'd picked up specifically to cover the last payment for her ridiculously expensive venue. I still had the check in my pocket, the ink barely dry, my life savings distilled into a single, flimsy piece of paper. The ache in my lower back was a familiar, screaming fire. For what? So she could stand here, wrinkle her nose at the honest smell of my life's work, and ask me to erase myself from the most important day of her life. The man standing behind her, her fiancé Mark, had the decency to look away, his gaze fixed on some abstract piece of art on the wall. He was a banker, from a family of bankers. They didn't have dirt under their nails. They had it buried in shell corporations and offshore accounts. The world went quiet. The frantic ticking of the minimalist clock on her wall sounded like a hammer on an anvil. In that moment, the exhaustion of 50 years settled on me like a physical weight. It wasn't just my body, it was my spirit. I had given her everything, and in return, she wanted me to give her one last thing: my absence. I reached into my jacket pocket, and she flinched, as if I might pull out a greasy rag and wipe it on her white sofa. I saw the relief in her eyes when I just pulled out my old leather checkbook, but then I didn't open it. I just held it, feeling its familiar weight. I looked from the checkbook to my hands, then to her. "So the smell of my work is offensive," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "But the money my work earned, that smells just fine." That's when it happened. She didn't answer. She just gave me a look of pure, unadulterated pity, the look you give a stray dog you wish would just wander off. And in that look, I finally understood. This wasn't about a smell. This was about a stain. I was the stain of her past. She was desperate to scrub clean before she could marry into her perfect, polished future. What did she think would happen next? That I would just nod, hand over the final check, and quietly disappear from her life? The daughter I had raised, the girl who used to watch me weld with wide, admiring eyes, was gone, and in her place was this stranger who saw me only as a dirty, embarrassing means to an end. My mind reeled back, away from the cold, white room and the stranger wearing my daughter's face, back to the roar and the heat of the mill. I remembered her as a little girl, after her mother passed, falling asleep on a pile of my work coats in the corner of the garage because she said they smelled like Dad. I remembered her first day of college, how she'd hugged me so tight, her face buried in my work shirt, whispering, "Thank you for everything, Daddy." I worked myself to the bone to give her a life without calluses, without the bone-deep weariness of manual labor. I sold my old, beloved truck to help pay for her law school books. I liquidated stocks I'd held for 30 years, the nest egg meant for my own retirement, to give her this dream wedding. All of it, every sacrifice, led to this moment, to being called a dirty laborer by the person who was the sole beneficiary of that labor. I walked out of her apartment without another word, the check still in my pocket. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into a deep, cold mine, the sterile chrome walls closing in, replacing the clean, white lie of her world with the crushing weight of reality. The bell chimed, a cheerful, mocking sound, and the doors slid open to the lobby. I stumbled out, my boots soundless on the polished marble, a surface meant for finer shoes than mine. When I reached the street, the city air, thick with exhaust and the distant wail of a siren, was a baptism. I leaned against a brick wall of the building adjacent to hers, the rough, gritty texture, a familiar comfort against my palm. It was real. It had history. It didn't judge. And right there, with the phantom scent of her expensive candle still clinging to my clothes, I felt the foundations of my world not just crack, but completely give way. The pain wasn't just emotional. It was a physical hollowing out, a seismic shift in my very core. The daughter I had poured my entire life into had just erased me. I started walking with no destination in mind. My feet, of their own volition, carried me away from the curated parks and designer storefronts of her neighborhood. Each step was a hammer blow, driving the truth deeper. A dirty laborer. The words echoed, not in her voice, but in the voice of every foreman who'd ever called me son, every piece of steel I'd ever bent to my will, every grimy dollar bill I'd ever tucked into her tiny pink backpack for ice cream. The memories weren't fond anymore. They were evidence. That old truck, a '78 Ford with an engine I'd rebuilt twice, was just the first of the amputations. I saw the buyer drive it away, a piece of my history vanishing. And I was left to wonder if she had ever truly known the cost of the quiet machinery of a father's ruin she left in her brilliant wake. All of it, every sacrifice, led to this moment, to being called a dirty laborer by the person who was the sole beneficiary of that labor. For 30 years, I'd treated that portfolio like a sacred text. Every quarterly report, every dividend reinvested, was a brick in the wall I was building against the uncertainty that had defined my own father's life. That was my get-out-of-jail-free card, my ticket to a small cabin by a lake where the only thing I'd have to weld would be a broken fishing rod. I watched the numbers on the screen zero out with a dizzying vertigo, liquidating the entire carefully constructed edifice of my security. It all vanished, converted into the ephemera of a single day, the white dress, the 5-tiered cake, the string quartet, and the approval of a man in a suit who probably didn't know a socket wrench from a salad fork. I found myself standing at a chain-link fence, looking into an active construction site. The roar was a symphony I understood. The guttural cough of a diesel generator, the high-pitched scream of a skill saw biting into wood, the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of a jackhammer. Men in hard hats and dusty jeans moved with a purpose I recognized, a language of gestures and grunts that spoke of tangible problems and tangible solutions. This was a world that made sense. You poured your sweat into something, and you saw it rise. It was honest. I watched a young welder, no older than my daughter, lower his hood. The brilliant blinding arc flared to life, a tiny sun contained within his gloves. I remembered her, no higher than my knee, sitting on an upturned bucket, her small face illuminated by that same otherworldly light. "You make magic, Daddy," she'd whispered once, her eyes wide with awe. I'd laughed, my voice muffled by the mask. "It's not magic, baby girl. It's just heat and patience." And now that magic had curdled into something shameful, a residue to be scrubbed away before her new life could begin. A cold fury began to seep into the hollow space inside me, thick and dark as crude oil. It wasn't just hurt anymore. It was a righteous, burning anger. What gave her the right? What gave that fiancé of hers, with his soft hands and his softer smile, the right to judge the very foundation upon which his future wife was built? My labor had bought her the luxury of looking down on labor. My hand closed around the check in my pocket. The paper felt flimsy, insignificant. It was the last tether, the final payment for my own obsolescence. I thought of handing it over, of completing my transformation from father to financier, from dad to donor. The image of her taking it, that look of pity replaced by one of satisfied finality, made my stomach turn. I wouldn't do it. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wouldn't vanish. I wouldn't be scrubbed clean from her story. She could build her perfect, polished future, but she would have to do it, knowing the dirty laborer was still here. A foundational crack in her pristine world that no amount of money or pretension could ever truly fill. Pushing off from the fence, I turned my back on the construction site. I had a different destination in mind now. The walk had a new purpose. The pain was still there, a raw, open wound, but the bleeding had stopped. She had tried to erase me. But you can't erase a foundation. You can only build on top of it and hope to God it never decides to settle. That night, I didn't sleep. I retreated to the garage, the only place that still felt like mine. My eyes, gritty with exhaustion and a rage cooling into something hard and permanent, fell on my old welding gear hanging from a hook like a suit of abandoned armor. Next to it, leaning against a shelf, was the cardboard tube. I knew what was inside without looking, but I pulled out the roll of dusty blueprints anyway. The paper crackled, a dry, ancient sound as I unfurled it on my workbench, using a can of grease and a socket wrench to hold down the corners. It was an ornate metal gate I'd designed years ago, a passion project I'd abandoned for the better pay of the mills. The Vinedresser's Gate, I'd called it. The design was a chaotic, beautiful tangle of grapevines and leaves, forged in steel, with clusters of grapes that would be hammered from copper so they'd verdigris over time into a soft, living green. It was excessive. It was impractical. It was the kind of thing a man builds when he believes beauty is a necessary, not an accessory. A memory, sharp and clear, pierced through the fog of my anger. I was 22, taking a night class at the community college just to feel like I was building something more than just muscle. The professor, a wiry man with clay permanently embedded under his fingernails, had wandered into the metal shop, drawn by the noise. He'd watched me for 10 minutes, not saying a word, as I worked on a small decorative bracket, using a hammer and chisel to texture the steel to look like tree bark. "You have the hands of a sculptor," he'd said, his voice quiet but carrying over the grinder's whine. "Most people fight the metal. You're conversing with it, a foundation of endurance." But I was wrong. My hidden power wasn't just my ability to endure labor, it was my ability to create beauty from raw, unforgiving steel. It was the magic she had seen as a child, the same magic she now wanted to scrub away as a residue of her shame. She thought my world was one of brute force and simple transactions. She had no idea it was also a world of precision and grace. My gaze drifted from the blueprint to the check, now lying on the bench beside it. It looked pathetic next to the sweeping, confident lines of my design. A flimsy printed token for my own erasure. The cold fury that had filled me at the fence post began to simmer, transforming from a stagnant pool of oil into a forge fire. A plan, raw and vengeful, began to take shape in my mind, as tangible as the metal I would bend to my will. I wouldn't cash the check. That would be an acceptance of her terms, an admission that my role in her life was now purely financial. No. This was a declaration of war, fought not with words but with work. I would build the gate, not for her, never for her, but for me. I would build it as a monument to the part of her that was still mine, to the foundation she was so desperately trying to pave over. And then I would give it to her, a wedding present. The irony was a physical ache. She and her fiancé, with his soft hands and his landscape architect's eye for curated beauty, would install my labor at the very threshold of their new life. Every time she passed through it, her hand would brush against the cold, hard truth of me. Her husband would see a tradesman's handicraft, a quaint artifact from a world he didn't understand. But she would feel the heat of the forge and hear the hiss of hot metal meeting water. She would remember the magic. I pulled my welding jacket from the hook, the heavy leather stiff with disuse. I plugged in the angle grinder, its cord coiling on the floor like a restless serpent. The garage, once a tomb of abandoned dreams, hummed back to life. The fluorescent lights flickered, then blazed, bleaching the concrete floor and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like excited spectators. I picked up a length of steel rebar, cold and rough. This was my raw material. This was my language. The pain was still there, a constant low thrum in my chest, but it was no longer a wound. It was a fuel. She had tried to pay me off, to turn me into a ghost. But you don't erase a foundation. You build on top of it. And now, this foundation had decided not just to settle, but to rise. I flipped down my welding mask, the world narrowing to the small tinted window. I struck an arc, and a star was born in the heart of my garage, spitting white-hot light, ready to burn her pristine world down with the beauty I would build. By dawn, the grief had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. She was ashamed of my work, of me. Fine. She wanted a perfect wedding, a grand entrance into her new life. She would have it, just not funded by the dirty laborer she so despised. My revenge wouldn't be angry or loud. It would be an act of creation, a quiet, irrefutable demonstration of what these hands could truly do. The grinder screamed, biting into the rebar and sending a shower of orange sparks over my boots. This was the foundational work of building my argument, my revenge. With every cut and spark, I was not just shaping steel, but forging my response to the polished stranger she had become, channeling the memory of the grease-stained girl who once saw magic in the scent of ozone. I worked through the day, the sun arcing across the grimy garage window, its light struggling to compete with the artificial star I kept reigniting at the tip of my electrode. My body fell into the old, familiar rhythm, the ache in my lower back from hunching over, the dull burn in my shoulders from holding the torch steady. It was a penitent's pain, a purifying fire. I didn't sketch a design. I let the steel speak, listening to the memory of her childhood. The central motif came to me first, a sprawling oak tree, its trunk forged from thick twisted cables, its canopy a complex lattice of leaves I would painstakingly form from thinner gauge metal. That was the tree in her parents' backyard, the one with the tire swing where she'd spend hours, her small hands gripping the rough rope, her laughter echoing as I pushed her higher, always higher. Beneath the oak, I began to shape two figures, their forms abstract, suggested more than rendered. One was tall, a parent, their hand resting on the shoulder of the smaller one. A dog, a scruffy mutt named Buster we'd found together, curled at their feet. These weren't just decorative elements. They were memories made manifest, ghosts I was trapping in cold iron. As the days bled into nights, the garage became my world. The air grew thick with the smells of seared metal, sweat, and the bitter coffee I drank to keep the tremors of exhaustion at bay. My hands, once soft from a year of office work, were again a roadmap of small burns and fresh calluses. I welcomed them. Each new mark was a badge, a reclamation of the identity she had asked me to shed. I didn't just assemble the pieces. I fused them with a rough, unrefined technique, letting the hammer marks show and the imperfections hold the light. Her fiancé, the landscape architect, would see only the flaws. He would see the deliberate, rough-hewn quality as a lack of finish. He would never understand that I was building a soul, not a product. The final piece was the most personal, the most dangerous. On the inside of the main post, the part that would face their house, I fashioned a small, hidden locket. It was a delicate, almost foolish thing to include in such a brutalist piece. From a scrap of copper, I hammered out a tiny, perfect maple seed, a helicopter, as we used to call them. We'd spend autumns collecting them by the handful, tossing them into the air and watching them spiral down. Inside this copper seed I placed the only photograph I had of us, taken a lifetime ago on a dusty fairground. We were maybe 16, our faces smudged with dirt, sharing a greasy bag of fries, laughing so hard we were crying. I sealed it behind a wafer-thin piece of quartz I'd melted from beach glass. It was my secret, my landmine. The morning of the delivery, I stood back and looked at the finished gate. It was massive, heavier than I'd intended, and undeniably beautiful in a way that was almost frightening. The oak tree was a testament of strength, the figures beneath it a silent poem of belonging. The vines that curled around the frame weren't tame, decorative things. They were wild and tenacious, threatening to pull the whole structure back into the earth from which its materials came. I had polished it to a dark, satin sheen, but the soul of the forge was still there, in every hammer stroke, every deliberate weld bead. I loaded it onto my truck myself, the weight of it a satisfying strain on my muscles. I didn't call her. I just drove to the address she'd given me for the commission, a sprawling new construction on a manicured lot that smelled of money and freshly laid sod. Her fiancé was there, overseeing the planting of some pathetic ornamental trees. He watched me unload it with a look of bewildered disdain, his soft hands shoved into the pockets of his pristine khakis. "Just lean it against the porch for now," he said, his voice dismissive. "The installers will handle it later." I maneuvered the gate into place, my hands blackened and strong, a stark contrast against the dark metal. As I turned to leave, I saw her, standing at the large picture window, a silhouette against the sterile white interior. She was perfectly still, one hand pressed to the glass. I couldn't see her expression from this distance, and I didn't need to. The gate was between us now, a truth she could no longer ignore. It was planted. Let it grow. The first phone call I made was not to my daughter, but to the wedding venue. I used my calmest, most reasonable voice. I was Mr. Henderson, the primary financier of the wedding. There had been an unforeseen issue with the estate, and I was regretfully forced to cancel the booking. I told the same story to the caterer, the florist, and the band. I ate the cost of the deposits without a second thought. The money was nothing. It was the sound of their plans crumbling, the silent severing of a single gilded thread in the tapestry they were weaving that felt like a down payment on my own sanity. Each call was a small, precise incision. I imagined the ripple of confusion, the frantic texts pinging between my daughter, Amelia, and her fiancé, Mark. The venue just called. They said your father cancelled. I could almost hear the tinny, bewildered tone of his voice. My hands, still smelling of metal polish and the forge, dialed the numbers with a steady certainty I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't sabotage. It was a controlled demolition. I saved the call to the baker for last. The cake was to be a monstrous, six-tiered confection of fondant and gold leaf, a design Amelia had shown me with a gleam in her eye that looked more like avarice than joy. When the baker, a woman named Carol with a genuinely kind voice, expressed her disappointment, I almost broke character. "It's a real shame," she sighed. "The design was so unique. All those intricate metalwork motifs." She said it was inspired by her father's craft. "Yes," I managed, my voice gravelly. "A shame. Send the final invoice." I had almost used it in the gate, a final hidden shard of our shared history pressed into the heart of the oak tree. But I'd held it back. Some secrets are too potent to give away. The phone rang. It was her. Not Amelia, her mother, Evelyn. The sound of her ringtone was a drill to the temple. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, my screen lit up with her message. I didn't need to listen to know the tone. The sharp, clipped syllables of a woman whose perfect world had just developed a hairline fracture. My own phone began to buzz then, a different, more insistent rhythm. Mark. He called 3 times in succession. I pictured him on that sprawling porch, his soft hands gesticulating at my creation, which was probably still leaning against his sterile wall. An ill-mannered guest. He wouldn't know what to do with it. He'd call an art installer who would treat it like a problem to be solved, bolting it into place without understanding the first thing about the tension in its vines or the story in its figures. I drove. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to be away from the phone. Away from the 4 walls that were starting to feel like a confessional. I ended up at the coast, at the same stony stretch of beach where I'd found the quartz a lifetime ago. The wind was sharp, whipping the sea into a grey fury. This was the truth, not the manicured lawns or the picture windows. This was the chaos and the beauty that could actually shape a soul. I thought of Amelia at the window, her hand pressed against the glass. Was it a gesture of longing? Of regret? Or was it the horror of a curator realizing a dangerous, living thing had been introduced into her pristine exhibit? The gate was my argument. It was my life. Translated into iron and oak, it said, "This is where you come from. This strength, this wildness, this is your inheritance. Not his khakis, not his pathetic trees." It was hung between two massive brick pillars that flanked the entrance to their driveway. A jarring, magnificent anomaly in that landscape of conformity. The photographer had caught it at an angle that emphasized its sheer, unapologetic mass. The text below it was from Mark. Installed. It's a statement. Amelia hasn't stopped looking at it. They had made it the first thing you saw, the last thing you left behind. They thought they had contained it, framed it, made it a part of their property. They didn't understand. You don't install a landmine. You just wait for it to go off. I put the truck in gear. The sliver of quartz was a heavy, warm secret in my pocket. Let them look. Let her look. The gate was planted. Let it grow. The manager of the venue, a woman named Carol with kind eyes set in a perpetually tired face, was surprisingly understanding. "To be honest, Mr. Henderson," she confided, "the groom's parents have been a nightmare, a constant, low-grade hum of dissatisfaction." She told me about the Hamiltons' lavish demands, imported peonies, a 5-tiered cake that was more architectural marvel than dessert. It was all a confirmation of what I already knew. They were just as invested in this flawless, suffocating facade as my daughter Sarah was. I left the venue, the Grandview Manor, a name so blatantly aspirational it felt like a parody, with Carol's commiseration, a small, warm stone in my pocket. It didn't change anything, but it was a landmark. It proved I wasn't entirely crazy for seeing the puppet strings. The drive back to my rented room was a blur of manicured hedges and tasteful beige signage. My phone, a dumb, brick-like thing, felt heavy on the passenger seat. It was the only connection to the other reality, the one I had forged in iron and left planted like a seed in their perfect soil. Back in the sterile quiet of the room, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty, it was charged. I took the sliver of quartz from my pocket, its milky surface holding a storm of captured light. It was a tiny piece of that wild, wind-whipped coast, a shard of the true world. I placed it on the cheap nightstand, a stark contrast to the laminated particle board. Then I opened the text message again. The photograph of the gate. They had installed it. Not tucked away in a private garden, not displayed as quirky art beside a koi pond. They had hung it at the entrance. The threshold. Mark's message echoed in my head. It's a statement. Amelia hasn't stopped looking at it. And they had made it the first thing you saw, the last thing you left behind. They thought they had contained it. They'd framed it, lit it from below with discreet spotlights like a museum piece, made it a part of their property, another expensive acquisition. A slow, grim smile touched my lips. You don't install a landmine, you just wait for it to go off. The phone vibrated in my hand, startling me. Not a text, a call, the same unknown number. Mark. I let it ring 3 times, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room, before I answered. I said nothing. "David?" His voice was tight, a violin string tuned a half-step too high. "Are you there?" "The installers said they'd never seen anything like it. The weight of it. Had to bring in a special rig." Or was it the horror of a curator, realizing a dangerous living thing had been introduced into her pristine exhibit? The Hamiltons, well, they think it's a bit much. Barbara called it aggressively rustic. I suppose it's not. He took a breath as if steeling himself. "The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow night, at the country club, 7 o'clock. You'll be there." Outside, the world was a symphony of orderly streetlights and quiet, respectable lives. But in the darkness, the gate was growing. I could feel it. It was no longer just iron and oak. It was a question. It was a memory. It was a reflection of a wilder truth, and it was staring back at my daughter, waiting for her to recognize her own face in its tangled, unyielding metal. Let them look. Let her look. The gate was planted, and now it was beginning to root. The money was gone, of course, the ghost of my old Ford F-150, and the future I'd meticulously saved for, all spent on deposits I'd willingly torched. In its place sat a hollow victory and a cold fury. I couldn't give them what was left of me, not like that. So I drove past the bank and kept going, all the way to a grim, corrugated metal building on the industrial edge of the city that smelled of diesel and ozone. Inside, under the flickering fluorescence, I found it. A massive raw block of Corten steel, 6 feet long and half as thick. It wasn't pretty. It was a brutalist brick, a cold, rust-streaked monolith. The salesman, a man with grease under his fingernails, looked from me to the block and back again. "You got a forklift for that, Pops?" I just shook my head and handed him a wad of cash. It took 3 of them to wrestle it into the bed of my rented pickup, the suspension groaning in protest. For the next 3 weeks, my 2-car garage ceased to be a place for cars. It became a sanctuary of fire and force, a chapel where my only prayers were the hiss of the acetylene torch and the percussive gospel of my hammer. I moved the lawnmower and the dusty boxes of Christmas decorations into the driveway, a silent declaration of war on my own orderly life. The neighbors, Barbara Hamilton's spiritual cousins, would slow their SUVs to a crawl, their faces pressed to the windows, a mixture of curiosity and disgust etched on their features. I didn't care. Let them look. The work was a physical exorcism. Each day I would wake before dawn, my body aching in protest, and walk into that garage as if entering a trance. I'd fire up the torch, the blue-orange flame roaring to life, and lay its searing tongue against the steel's cold skin. The metal would glow, first a sullen cherry, then a blazing orange, finally a weeping, incandescent yellow. In that state, it was no longer inert. It was alive, malleable, ready to accept my will. And my will was not to create something beautiful. It was to create something true. I wasn't sculpting a decorative piece for a garden. I was building a reliquary for a ghost, a monument to a love that had been paved over and forgotten. My rage was the fuel. 50 years of it, rage at the cancer that stole Sarah, rage at the polished emptiness of my life without her, rage at Mark for his betrayal, and at the Hamiltons for their casual, unthinking erasure of our history. I poured it all into the metal. With every swing of the hammer, I was screaming. She existed. We existed. It remembers the shape you beat it into, the heat you subject it to. This block of Corten would remember my grief. I welded jagged seams that looked less like joins and more like scars. I twisted sections with immense hydraulic clamps, creating spirals of tortured metal that refused to conform. I left some edges raw and sharp, refusing to soften them, a deliberate danger in a world that demanded safety. My hands, already rough from a lifetime of work, became a map of this new obsession. Burns blistered and calloused over. A shard of hot steel embedded itself in my forearm, and I dug it out with a pocket knife, wiping the blood on my jeans before going back to work. The pain was clarifying. It was a reminder that I, too, was still made of flesh and blood, not just the ghost I felt myself becoming. At night, I'd collapse onto a cot I'd dragged in, the scent of scorched metal and my own sweat a pungent lullaby. In the half-sleep of exhaustion, the sculpture would shift in the shadows. It was no longer just a collection of forged pieces. It was a gate, not a welcoming one. It was the kind of gate you'd find at the entrance of a forgotten wood, one that warned you to turn back. It was tangled and unyielding, a briar patch rendered in iron, and at its center, if you stared long enough, you could almost see a path leading into a profound, waiting darkness. The final night I stood before it, the garage lights throwing long, dancing shadows. It was complete. It was ugly. It was aggressive. It was the most honest thing I had ever made. I ran a hand over its rough, rust-textured surface, the corten steel already beginning to show its characteristic protective patina of decay. It felt like skin. It felt like a verdict. I thought of Lily, my daughter with her artist's soul, trapped in their gilded cage. Mark said she couldn't look away from the smaller version I'd sent. He said it was like it was asking her a question. This, the final piece, was the rest of that question. It was the memory of her mother's wild, untamable laugh. It was the reflection of the father she used to know, the one who built tree houses and told stories about knights and ancient forests before he shrank into a quiet, manageable man. I killed the lights and left it there in the dark, a sleeping giant in a suburban garage. The gate was planted, and now it was beginning to root. Tomorrow, I would go to their rehearsal dinner. I would wear a tie and make polite conversation. I would play my part. But this, the thing of fire and memory I had birthed, was my final, unassailable truth. It was waiting for her. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my bone-tired core, that it would not wait quietly for long. The call from Sarah came 2 days later, a shriek of pure fury that seemed to vibrate through the phone, a sound so sharp it could have scored the quiet, dusty air of my garage. The venue cancelled. The caterer cancelled. "What did you do?" I could hear her sputtering on the other end, the furious clicking of a keyboard as she tried to process a problem that couldn't be solved with a credit card or a cutting remark. She and her fiancé's family scrambled, their collective arrogance leading them to believe they could simply rebook everything at the last minute. They were masters of a world governed by contracts and confirmations, a world I had just quietly set on fire. I listened to her subsequent, increasingly panicked updates with a detached calm. The country club was booked for a corporate retreat. The renowned chef was suddenly on a culinary sabbatical in Provence. Every elegant, overpriced alternative they pursued crumbled to dust the moment their name was mentioned. It was a silent, systemic rejection, and I knew its source. It wasn't magic. It was the simple, brutal leverage of a lifetime of designing structures. I knew the men who poured the foundations for these temples of privilege. I'd shared coffee with the electricians who wired their chandeliers, a few calls, a few owed favors, and the entire gilded edifice of Sarah's perfect wedding had been rendered a house of cards in a stiff breeze. But my focus wasn't on Sarah's crumbling empire. It was on Lily. I had planted the gate, and now I was watching for the first green shoots. The first sign came not from Lily, but from Mark. His text was terse, devoid of his usual corporate sheen. "Lily's been quiet. She's not helping Sarah, just sits in her room drawing. She drew that thing you sent her. I had the strangest dream." "Is that crazy?" I put on my uniform. The bland tie, the forgiving slacks, the mask of the manageable man, and went to play my part. The air in the room was thick with strained politeness and barely concealed fury. Sarah's face was a tight, painted mask. Her fiancé's family huddled together, casting suspicious glances at me, the financial liability. Mark looked exhausted, a man trying to hold up a collapsing ceiling with sheer willpower. But Lily was a ghost at the feast. She sat apart, picking at her salmon, her gaze distant. She looked through the people, through the walls, seeing something else entirely. I saw her fingers, under the table, tracing a pattern on her napkin. The same tangled, thorny pattern of the gate. The breaking point came when Sarah's future father-in-law, a man whose smile was a credit report, made a toast. "To family," he boomed, "and to overcoming unexpected obstacles with grace and resilience." A cheap, polished lie, and I saw Lily flinch as if struck. Later, as the dreadful evening was winding down, I found her standing by a large, tinted window, staring at her own reflection superimposed over the city lights. I came to stand beside her, our twin images faint in the glass. "They're going to pave the old Miller property," she said quietly, not looking at me. "Put up more condos. Sarah and Robert are buying the penthouse. They showed me the floor plans. It's sterile, The carefully constructed world of the dinner, the clinking glasses, the false laughter, the entire suffocating performance, shattered. The gate had spoken. It had not waited quietly. I simply looked at her, my silence all the confirmation she needed. The path through the profound, waiting darkness was now open, and my daughter was standing at its head. A week before the wedding, my daughter Sarah and her future mother-in-law, the formidable Mrs. Hamilton, appeared at my door. Their faces were masks of cold fury. I'd been expecting them ever since the disastrous rehearsal dinner. Sarah herself had been quiet since that night at the window, a quietness that felt less like peace and more like the gathering of a storm. They didn't wait for an invitation. Sarah stepped in, her posture rigid, her eyes chips of flint. "We need to talk, Dad, now." Her gaze swept over the cluttered living room, the stacks of books and half-finished sketches, and her lip curled in a silent judgment that was more eloquent than any speech. "The money, David," Sarah said, her voice clipped. "The final payment for the venue is due tomorrow. You promised." But that was before Lily's whisper by the window. "It's asking me to come see it, isn't it?" The gate was no longer just my secret. It was our shared burden, our shared truth, and truth has a way of burning through promises made in falsehood. I said nothing. Words felt useless, little paper boats against the tide of their certainty. Instead, I turned and walked, leading them through the labyrinth of my home, past the kitchen where Lily's childhood drawings were still pinned under a magnet, through the dusty sunroom and into the cavernous space of the garage. I didn't turn on the main light. The dim glow from a single dangling bulb was enough. It caught the edges first, the sharp, rusted curves and the tangled, thorny welds that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. The sculpture dominated the space, a leviathan of scrap metal and forgotten things. It was more than half finished now. The central arch, the gate, was complete. A dark maw leading into a complex, coiled heart of gears and spirals that defied any known geometry. It wasn't a pile of rust. It was a captured shadow, a three-dimensional echo of the pattern Lily had traced on her napkin. Mrs. Hamilton was the first to break the heavy silence. She laughed, a short, sharp sound like breaking glass. "So this is where the money went? All of it? You'd rather build this pile of rust than pay for your own daughter's wedding?" She took a step closer, her eyes wide, not with awe, but with a kind of horrified recognition. "My God, Dad, it's the same as the drawings Lily used to make, the ones from her episodes." She turned to me, her face a mess of confusion and betrayal. "You're still encouraging that, after everything the doctors said? You're spending our future on this? Understand," she spat, her composure cracking. "I understand that you've chosen a fantasy over your own family. You've always chosen her nightmares, her delusions. You built her a world of monsters, and now you're building one out of metal. What is it, Dad? A shrine to her madness?" In the gloom, I could almost see it breathing, a subtle shift in the shadows that might have been a trick of the light. But I knew it wasn't. Mrs. Hamilton shook her head, a gesture of pure, unadulterated pity. "Robert was right. He said you were unstable, a poor financial risk. We should have just written the check ourselves and been done with you. This thing is an embarrassment." Hamilton's smug superiority vanished, replaced by a primal fear. Her eyes darted around the dark garage, as if seeing it for the first time. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I just looked at the gate, at the profound darkness waiting within its arch. It had reacted. It had felt their disdain, their poisonous certainty, and it had answered. "The money is gone," I said, my gaze still locked on the sculpture. "It's in the steel, the copper, the silence. It's part of this now. I can't give it back." The front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. I was alone again with the gate. The hum had subsided, but the air still thrummed with its residual energy. I walked toward it, my hand outstretched, but I didn't dare touch the cold, rusted surface. I had told Lily the gate was asking for her. But in that moment, with the taste of my daughter's contempt still sharp in the air, I knew it was asking for something else too. It was asking for a sacrifice, and I had just given it one. The day before the wedding was a Tuesday. Her new, cheaper venue had cancelled due to a double booking. The new caterer was demanding cash up front. The entire, hastily rebuilt house of cards was collapsing. At dusk, Sarah's car pulled into my driveway. She got out, alone this time. The anger was gone, replaced by a pale, ragged desperation. She walked to my front door, a ghost of the bride she was supposed to be. I watched her from the living room window, my breath fogging the glass. The sight of her so diminished sent a jolt of something bitter and painful through me. Pity, yes, but also a terrible, burgeoning understanding. This was no coincidence. The venue, the caterer, the cascade of failures. It felt orchestrated. It felt like a demand. She didn't ring the bell. She just stood there on the welcome mat, her shoulders slumped, her hands shoved into the pockets of her thin jacket. I opened the door before she could change her mind. The air that rushed in was cold, but the silence that followed her in was colder. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice a scrap of sound. "Sarah." I stepped back, letting her enter the space that had become a shrine to my obsession. The house was dim, the only light spilling from the open garage door at the end of the hall. She didn't look toward it. Her eyes were fixed on me, hollow and tired. "It's all falling apart," she stated, the words flat, devoid of their previous theatrical despair. This was real. The venue in Burlington is gone. They just called. The caterer won't answer his phone unless I call from a different number, and then he just says, "Cash or nothing." Mom can't help. She's tapped out. She finally let her gaze drift past me, taking in the dusty living room, the uncurtained windows. I don't have anything left. The unspoken plea hung between us, thick and suffocating. The money. Just give me the money back. But the money was gone, absorbed into the gate's cold, rusted being. I had told her that, but she hadn't believed me. Now, standing in the evidence of my ruin, maybe she was starting to. "I can't give you what I don't have, Sarah," I said, the words tasting like ash. "It's not in a bank. It's not under the floorboards. It's in there." I gestured with my head toward the garage. A flicker of the old anger crossed her face, but it was weak, a dying ember. "Don't," she whispered, closing her eyes. "Please, don't start with that again. I can't hear about your sculpture right now. It was a trick of the light. It doesn't want worship. It wants substance. It took the money. It took my time, my focus. It took your mother's pride. And now it's taking your day. Your perfect day." I turned and walked toward the garage, my heart hammering against my ribs. I half expected to hear the front door slam shut behind me, her final retreat. But after a moment of suspended silence, I heard the soft, hesitant scuff of her shoes on the hardwood floor. She was following. I pushed the garage door fully open. The single bulb was on, casting its jaundiced glow over the space. The gate stood where it always did, a stark black arch against the cinder-block wall. It was silent, inert. Yet the air in the garage was different, heavier, charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Sarah stopped in the doorway, refusing to cross the threshold. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "It's just a thing, Dad. A bunch of old rusty metal. Look into it." From the depths of the gate, a sound emerged, not the hum from before. This was different, a soft, rhythmic, metallic ticking. Tick, tick, tick. It was the sound of a dozen tiny, unseen clocks, or the sound of insectoid legs tapping against steel. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "What is that?" It was the sound of a typewriter key striking paper, sharp and final. Click. She wasn't looking at a stranger or a fanatic anymore. She was looking at a hole in the world, a hole that had just spoken with the voice of her dead sister. She stumbled back, her legs giving way, and collapsed to her knees in the hallway, sobbing. Great, ragged, soul-wrenching sobs that held more truth than any word she'd spoken to me in years. I didn't go to her. I stood my ground, my own blood running cold, my own heart a frantic drum against the gate's terrible ticking silence. It had asked for a sacrifice, and I had given it my relationship with my daughter. Now, it had taken something more. It had taken her peace. It had taken her past, and it had just begun to speak. She didn't knock. She just stood on my porch as I opened the door, a ghost in a rain-spattered coat. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please." Everything is ruined. In that moment, the defiant woman was gone, and in her place was the child I'd once soothed after nightmares, now consumed by a waking one. Her plea was a confession of a bridge burned too thoroughly. I didn't move. I just stood there, the threshold of my house feeling like the border of a foreign, hostile nation. I could see the aftermath of that night in the hallway a week ago, etched into every line of her face. The vibrant, stubborn woman who had confronted me was gone, replaced by this hollowed-out creature, trembling with a fear that had nothing to do with cold feet, and everything to do with a voice from a cold grave. "Help you with what, Sarah?" My own voice was flat, a stone dropped into a well. I made no move to let her in. The memory of her sobs, the sound of the gates ticking, the reedy whisper of my dead daughter's voice. It was all a fresh wound, throbbing in the space between us. "You know what?" she choked out, her eyes wide and pleading. "It won't stop. In my head. That voice. I can't sleep, I can't think. Mark thinks I'm having a breakdown. Maybe I am." A hysterical laugh bubbled up and died in her throat. "But you're not surprised, are you? You knew that thing was real." She didn't take off her coat, just stood dripping onto the worn floorboards of the foyer, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "It spoke to me again last night," she said, her gaze fixed on some middle distance, seeing nothing in my presentable, normal-looking living room. Just as I was falling asleep, not a whisper this time, clear. So clear it was like she was standing right next to the bed. What did it say? It was learning, adapting, using the most intimate weapons from my past to wage its war on my present. I had thought its target was me, my work, my sanity. I was wrong. Its target was my entire bloodline. "It wants something," I said, the words tasting like ash. "It always has. It asked for a sacrifice. I thought giving it my attention, my life's work, was enough. I thought the strain it put on us was just a byproduct. But it wasn't. It was the point. It uses her memory as a key to pick the locks in our minds. It doesn't want to protect you, Sarah. It wants to own you. It wants to own us both. We smash it to pieces. So what do we do?" she asked, her voice small and defeated. I looked at my daughter, truly looked at her for the first time in years. Not as the stranger she'd become, but as the little girl who used to climb into my lap when she had a nightmare. The gate had taken that from us too. It had taken the simple paternal comfort of being able to tell her everything would be all right. "We listen," I said, the words feeling like a betrayal. "We play its game. The wedding is tomorrow. We go. We see what happens. It's given you a warning. We need to understand why." There was no fighting. There was only the terrible ticking patience of the thing in the basement and the two of us, caught in its web, waiting for its next move. She had come to me for a solution, for a father's rescue, and all I could offer her was a deeper descent into the nightmare. And the most horrifying part was, she knew I was right. The silence in the kitchen was a physical thing, thick and suffocating, broken only by the tinny, eager voice coming from my phone's speaker. "Mr. Henderson, are you there? This is an unprecedented offer for an unsolicited peace." I saw the conflict warring in her gaze. The part of her that was still a pragmatic, ambitious young woman, dazzled by the number, and the part that now knew that number was written in blood and rust, and something far worse. "Julian," I said, my voice rough, cutting him off. "That's unexpected. My client is a connoisseur of the unique. They see the raw power in it." Enthusiasm of this magnitude is a fleeting thing." He hung up. The click of the call disconnecting seemed to snap Sarah out of her stupor. "6 figures," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "For that thing downstairs. Dad, that's life-changing money. We could leave. We could pack a bag right now and just go." A car speeding down a highway, the rain clearing, the oppressive weight of this house shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was nothing. But the image was a mirage. I saw the way the wire had curled around my wrist, not with malice, but with a dreadful, possessive familiarity. I remembered its voice, not in my ears, but in the very meat of my thoughts. It's rooted itself here. Our sanity. It offered me a warning, and now it's offering us a fortune. What does it want? If we take that money, we're accepting its patronage. We're saying we approve of its art. The practical part of my mind, the part that had worried about mortgage payments and retirement funds for 30 years, was screaming at me to call Julian back, to take the money and deal with the metaphysical consequences later. But the father in me, the part that had just rediscovered the ghost of his little girl in this terrified woman's eyes, knew that some debts could never be repaid. "So we say no," Sarah said, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "We turn down the money and we go to the wedding tomorrow, utterly broke and completely terrified. Is that the plan? But on one condition. We're poking it with a stick to see if it bites. If the sale goes through and the sculpture leaves, maybe its influence leaves with it. Or maybe..." I trailed off, the other, more frightening possibility hanging unspoken between us. Maybe it gets angry. It's a matter of some urgency. The house seemed to hold its breath with us. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window panes in the wind felt like a comment, a reaction. I half expected the lights to flicker and die, or for the basement door to swing open on its own. But nothing happened. The silence from below was absolute, and somehow that was worse than any noise it could have made. It was the silence of a predator watching, waiting to see what the foolish prey would do next. At 5 minutes to 10, a sleek black van with no markings pulled into our driveway. 2 men in dark utilitarian coveralls got out. They were polite, professional, and utterly devoid of curiosity. They didn't ask why we were selling or why it had to be tonight. They just nodded, handed me a tablet to confirm the wire transfer, a number with so many zeros it felt fictional, and headed for the basement door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I unlocked it. The smell of ozone and damp earth billowed out. The men descended, their heavy boots echoing on the wooden steps. Sarah gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. We listened to the grunts of effort, the screech of metal on concrete as they shifted the monstrous weight of the sculpture. And then they were carrying it up, bundled in moving blankets, a cocoon of hidden malevolent art. It passed between us, a shrouded corpse on its way to a new grave. For a fleeting second, as it crossed the threshold of the front door, I felt a sharp psychic twinge, a sensation of something being severed, a wire snapping. The door closed. The van's engine started, and its taillights disappeared into the rainy dark. We stood in the sudden, empty silence of the hallway. The money was in our account. The thing was gone from our basement. Sarah let out a shaky breath. "It's over?" I was listening, with every fiber of my being, to the new silence from below. It wasn't empty. It was patient. It was the silence of a chess master who has just watched his opponent take a pawn, knowing the queen was already in position for checkmate. We had taken its offering. We had played its game. And I knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in my veins, that the next move was going to be its. The color drained from Sarah's face as she stood in my garage, the very place she had once dismissed as housing a pile of rust. That pile, she now understood, was a sculpture worth more than her entire cancelled wedding. I watched the realization dawn. "You said you couldn't have a dirty laborer walk you down the aisle," I reminded her quietly. "This is what a dirty laborer does. It seems some people find value in it." My sister Chloe stared at me, her mouth a perfect shocked O. The caterers bustled around us, the clinking of fine china, and the murmur of 100 guests, a stark, frivolous soundtrack to the collapse of her entire worldview. I saw the calculations happening behind her eyes, the Vera Wang gown, the 5-tiered cake, the string quartet. All of it suddenly dwarfed, rendered trivial, by the truth of what I'd kept bolted to my garage floor. But the news, the article, she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy thing. They said the buyer was anonymous, that it broke records for a living artist. The wire transfer cleared 2 days ago. Sarah found me on the terrace, leaning against the railing and staring out at the manicured golf course that served as the wedding's backdrop. She slipped her hand into mine, her skin warm and real, an anchor in the surreality. "You told her," she said, not a question. I had to. I squeezed her hand. After everything, after that thing, I couldn't let her comment about my dirty hands go unanswered. It felt like the last lie I had the energy to tolerate. My new brother-in-law's stuffy father, who had spent the cocktail hour lecturing me on the stability of a real career in finance, was now making a beeline toward us, a fresh glass of scotch in each hand. "Christ," I muttered. "We can leave," Sarah whispered. "We have the money to just leave." It was a transaction. We had sold the sculpture, but we had bought something too. A consequence. The silence in our basement was proof of that. The rest of the reception was a blur of forced smiles and clumsy congratulations. People weren't celebrating Chloe's marriage anymore. They were celebrating my bank account, a mythical beast they all wanted to touch for luck. I felt like I was wearing a suit made of $100 bills, and everyone could see it. When we finally escaped, the silence of the car was a blessing. I drove, my hands tight on the wheel, the familiar streets of our neighborhood looking different, softer at the edges, as if viewed through a pane of expensive, warped glass. "It's over, right?" Sarah asked, her voice small in the dark of the car. It was the same question she'd asked in the hallway after the men in coveralls had left. I still didn't have a good answer. "The sculpture is gone," I said, choosing my words with the care of a bomb disposal expert. "The money is ours. That part of the deal is done. But nothing," I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Let's just go inside." A low, resonant hum, so deep it was almost a vibration, a tectonic pressure. It was coming from below. Sarah froze on the threshold, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" I didn't need to go down there. I knew what I would find. Not the sculpture. That was gone, en route to some collector's sterile penthouse or private vault. No, we had sold the symptom, but the disease had remained. The silence from below hadn't been empty. It had been patient, and now it was singing. It was the sound of a machine, dormant for decades, finally powering up. We hadn't won. We had simply paid for the privilege of turning the key. The game wasn't over. The first move had just been made. The sound from the basement was a physical thing now, a thrumming in the air that made the fine hairs on my arms stand erect. It vibrated up through the soles of my shoes, a deep, resonant shudder in the floorboards that I felt more than heard. Sarah's sobs, which had been a storm of raw human misery, faltered. She looked up from the dusty porch boards, her tear-streaked face a mask of confusion and a new dawning terror. The sound from the house was no longer just a noise. It was a presence, a predator's call that had just silenced the cries of its prey. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The question was so small, so utterly inadequate against the magnitude of that hum. I couldn't answer. My own heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs, a panicked counter-rhythm to the steady, industrial pulse from below. I'd just torn my daughter's world apart, had finally, after a lifetime of quiet failure, asserted a father's cruel authority. And the universe, or whatever lived in my basement, had chosen that exact moment to announce itself. The victory was ashes in my mouth, poisoned by the dread that had been my constant companion since I'd first found that obsidian sculpture. I stepped past her, back into the house. The air inside was cool and thick, heavy with the hum. It was like walking into the belly of a sleeping leviathan. Sarah scrambled to her feet and followed, her earlier despair forgotten. subsumed by a more immediate, visceral fear. She clutched at my arm, her fingers cold and desperate. "Dad?" The word, a title she hadn't used in years, hung in the vibrating air. It was a plea. The basement door stood across the living room. The new, gleaming deadbolt I'd installed after the sale, a futile attempt to lock away the memory, the feeling of that place, was now an object of ridicule. The sound wasn't coming from the other side of the door. It was the door, the floor, the very walls. The lock was as meaningless as a piece of jewelry on a bomb. I approached it, my hand trembling as I reached out. The polished steel of the deadbolt was ice cold, a chill that leached the warmth from my fingertips. It was the cold of deep earth, of buried things. "Don't," Sarah breathed, her voice tight. "Please, don't open it." We had sold the cork, and now the bottle was shaking itself apart. My fingers found the key in my pocket. The metal was warm from my body heat, a tiny pocket of defiance against the pervasive cold. The click of the lock disengaging was a sharp, insignificant sound, swallowed instantly by the all-encompassing hum. I turned the knob. The door swung inward on its own, as if pushed by the pressure of the sound. A wave of frigid, damp air washed over us, carrying the scent of ozone, of hot metal, and of something else, something ancient and mineral like the air in a deep cave. The stairs vanished into a profound darkness, a blackness that was not merely an absence of light, but a solid breathing entity. And from that darkness a light began to bloom. It was a faint, violet-tinged glow, flickering like faulty neon from the far corner of the basement, the exact spot where the sculpture had once sat. It pulsed in time with the hum, a visual heartbeat. "Oh, God," Sarah moaned, her grip on my arm tightening to the point of pain. I fumbled for the light switch on the wall beside the door, my palm slapping against the rough plaster. I flipped it. The single bare bulb at the bottom of the stairs buzzed and sputtered to life, its weak yellow light doing little to push back the oppressive gloom. It did, however, illuminate the stairs and a portion of the concrete floor. The basement was not as we had left it. The tidy shelves of canning jars my wife had put up a lifetime ago were now filmed with a fine, black dust, but it was the floor that held my gaze. Etched into the concrete, radiating out from the epicenter of the violet light, was a complex network of fine, silvery lines. They looked like frost heaves or the web of a colossal metallic spider. They hadn't been there yesterday. The hum intensified, the pitch rising slightly, becoming a questioning tone. The violet light brightened, and for a moment, I saw it. Not a machine, not in any sense I could understand. It was a pattern within the light, a shifting three-dimensional lattice of impossible geometry that hovered just above the floor. It was the heart of the sound, the source of the cold. Then, the voice. It didn't come from the basement. It came from inside my own head, a thought that was not my own, spoken in a language of pure concept and intent. It was the voice of the hum, the voice of the light. "The gate is unstable. The anchor is missing." The violet light flared, blindingly bright for a single, searing instant. When my vision cleared, the pattern was gone. The hum dropped back to its original deep thrum, but the pressure in the air remained, a promise and a threat. The silvery lines on the floor seemed to have multiplied, creeping an inch or two closer to the bottom of the stairs. I slowly, carefully pulled the door shut. The click of the latch was the most final sound I had ever heard. I leaned my forehead against the cold wood, my entire body shaking. I had just wanted to hurt her, to make her feel a fraction of the rejection she had dealt me. I had wanted to be the powerful one, for once, but my petty human vengeance had been a spark in a room full of gas. The game wasn't over. The first move had been made, and now it was our turn. And I had no idea what the rules were or what we were even playing for. I didn't pay for the lavish party. There was no simple check, no quiet lesson. The thing in the basement had seen to that. Our world had been cracked open, and the cold from between the stars now seeped into every silence. The money was meaningless. The wedding a forgotten triviality. She looked at me, her eyes wide and haunted, and I knew she finally understood. This wasn't about money. The only currency that mattered now was survival, and the only language left was the one being whispered from the darkness below, a language of missing anchors and unstable gates. There were no more words. She just nodded, a quick, jerky motion of acceptance before turning and walking away. The silence she left behind was different now. It was no longer empty. It was watchful, charged with the unspoken, terrible truth we had finally been forced to acknowledge. I returned to my workshop, the sanctuary of sawdust and honest sweat, but the familiar scent of pine and varnish couldn't mask the new metallic tang that seemed to have seeped into the very air of the house. My hands were stained with ink from the checkbook, not oil or paint, and the restoration of my dignity felt as fragile as glass. I was no longer just a laborer. I was an artist, a creator, a father who had finally taught his daughter the real meaning of value. Or so I tried to tell myself. The mantra felt hollow, a desperate incantation against the memory of that voice. The gate is unstable, the anchor is missing. It had a texture now, a low, resonant frequency that I felt in my molars, in the fillings of my teeth. It was a patient sound. It was waiting. My gaze fell upon the workshop floor. Near the door leading to the main house, a thin, silvery line like a vein of quicksilver had traced a path from under the basement door and was now creeping across the worn wooden planks. It wasn't a liquid. It was more like a fossilized crack of light, cold to the touch. I hadn't imagined it. It was spreading. The phone rang, shattering the oppressive stillness. I snatched it up, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was Sarah. "Dad?" Her voice was a thin wire of panic. It talked to me again, in the car. And it was so cold. She was crying now, soft, hiccuping sobs. "It feels like it's lost, and it's looking for something. It called me proximity. I'm just a proximity. I couldn't leave her alone with this." "No!" The terror in her voice was absolute. "Don't. It's quieter when I'm away from you, from the house. I think it's tied to the source, to the basement. When we're together, it gets louder, more focused." The hum seemed to have intensified, a subtle, mocking pulse. I looked at the block of maple, my project forgotten. An idea, desperate and insane, began to form. An artist, a creator. If this thing was communicating, maybe I could communicate back. Not with words, but with form. If it was lost, maybe it needed a map. If its gate was unstable, maybe it needed a new anchor. Not Sarah. Never Sarah. I spent the next few hours in a feverish state. I didn't try to create something beautiful. I tried to create something resonant. I carved into the maple, not a pattern but a concept. I carved the spiral galaxy I'd seen in my mind's eye, the dead stars represented by deep, empty pits. I carved lines of force and vectors, a crude representation of transmission and return. My hands moved with an intuition that wasn't entirely my own, guided by the lingering psychic scent of that lonely intelligence. I was trying to build a foundation, just as I'd preached to Sarah, but this one was for a door between worlds. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the workshop, I finished. The carving was crude, unsettling, a madman's scrawl in wood. But it felt significant. It felt like a key. Holding the carved block, I approached the basement door. The silvery lines on the floor seemed to pulse in anticipation. I could feel the cold radiating from the wood, a deep, spatial chill. This was it. My move. I wasn't just a spark in a room full of gas anymore. I was trying to become the architect of the firebreak. I knelt, my knees popping in the silence, and slowly, carefully, I slid the carved maple block across the floor until it touched the basement door. The moment the wood made contact, the deep thrum of the hum shifted. It didn't get louder. It changed pitch, softening into something that was almost inquisitive. the oppressive pressure in the air lessened by a fraction. A new image bloomed in my mind, not of dead stars, but of a single, complex symbol. A twisting, impossible knot of geometry. It was an answer, a request. The game was indeed on, and the rules were being written in real time. The anchor was missing, and the thing in the basement had just shown me what it needed me to build.